Thank you, Jason. I appreciate that very much. And I am thrilled to be back here at Web Unleashed. It's been several years, so I'm actually really glad to be back. It's a fantastic conference. And I just want to give a hand for the first day of this conference. Amazing talks, right? It's been really incredible stuff. I'm fully aware that I am standing between you and drinks and food. So at the end of the day, I know many of you are like, what's he going to talk about? How long is he going to take up here? But I want to share some thoughts about some things that I'm very passionate about. So let's jump into this talk, and we'll try not to take too much of your evening away from you. That was really bad loading. Sorry about that. I don't have anything to say about taxes or politics or anything like that, but I do want to talk about death. And in particular, I want to talk about death of ideas. Not like death of people, that's really morbid, but like death of ideas. And actually, it's not so much the death of ideas as it is when there's a death of an idea, there's usually the rebirth of an even better idea. So I want to talk about that. And by the way, that slow loading, that might have just been my bad Wi-Fi, so let's hope that doesn't, well, actually, that was a little better. It wasn't quite as janky, but actually, let's fix that for just a moment. Give me just a moment here. We're going to fix this, and then we'll refresh. Okay, that loaded a little bit better. Hopefully, that will improve. Okay, so actually, you know what? I don't like this color scheme. I'm going to go ahead and change one more thing. I'm going to turn on dark mode here. Yeah, that's much better. Much better. Okay. So listen, death, right? Death of ideas. This can also be said that change is this constant in our life. So really what we're talking about is not so much that a bad idea has to go away, but rather an idea that we have completely drank all that we can from. We've juiced it completely. And then it begins to change into a bigger and potentially better idea. And that's what I want to talk to you about tonight. And I just want to say right off the bat that I am not at all qualified to talk about this topic. Because as you heard from Jason in the intro, I'm hyper-focused on JavaScript. And this talk is not about JavaScript. Well, not really. I mean, it's going to get mentioned. But this is not a JavaScript talk. This is a web talk. And I'm giving this talk because I'm so passionate and I so believe in what we are as a community and what we have the potential to be doing for all 7.6 billion people on the planet. And I feel like we are missing out on a great amount of that potential. And that's the reason for this talk. I want to talk to you about how we are building the web and how we have been up to this point, and how I think that we should be focusing on building the web going forward. So let's, as all great talks do, let's do a quick little history lesson. In the beginning of the web, what was the web all about? Well, let's look at the very first web page. This was actually reconstructed by some folks when they went back and said, let's reconstruct the experience of what it was like in the first web page, and then they rebuilt what it was actually the first web browser. So there's a JavaScript version of this. You can literally go and experience the web the way that it was first envisioned. And very early on in the web, we began to see the web start to look like this. We began to see the formation, the foundation of this platform with HTML, with links to other pages. And you'll notice that it wasn't very fancy at all. But it got the job done. It communicated text, and it linked text and communicated information to people all over the world. And Tim Berners-Lee, when he invented the web, and this was in 1991, when he invented the web, that vision that he had where all of the world's information could be interlinked together, we saw those very first few steps here. Of course, as soon as people that were creative developers got a hold of a platform like this, they said, oh, no, that plain black and white text with the blue links, that'll never work. We're going to have to fix this up a little bit. So they began to create web pages like this. We've got to spruce up the web a bit. So back in 1995, this movie Space Jam came out, and we have this website that is actually still a real website today. And I guess they're doing a sequel to the movie, so maybe they'll update this website. But we wanted images, we wanted all of this fancy stuff. And of course, we needed moving text, so we invented the marquee and we added that to it, because the web is nothing if it's just static. It can't just deal with a web that's only static. And you'll notice also that we've got spinners and these loading icons, and greatest of all was the trailing mouse cursor. This was the pinnacle of what the web was supposed to be, right? This is what Tim envisioned, was that we would build the web. And you know what, I hope you agree with me that this is just way too much that's going on in this slide, all the spinners, and this is going to cause me problems. I'm going to make one last little change here. I'm going to go ahead and turn on the reduce motion and turn on preloading of images. That'll make the slides a lot better from here on out. Okay, so What I'm saying is that we need to begin to rethink and change how we are building the web. In those early days, we were, what can we put on the web? And arguably, I'd say today in 2019, we're still thinking with, what can we put on the web? What can we do on the web? And if we can do it, we should do it. Because if we can do it, then that must mean that people who use the web want it, that it'll make the web better. And I want you to begin to ask yourself, is that really true? Is it really true that just because we can, that we should? Because I'm kind of convinced that maybe we're missing out. So the early web was built like this. And some of you that have been around long enough, I've been around and I have the beard to prove it. I've been around long enough to remember when we built the web where everything was strung together. And now we've come full circle. We do that again. Now we just call it things like Angular and other things. You know, we put all these things in one file. But for a while we said, no, that's not the way to do it. And the prophets of the web, they said, absolutely, we can't be stringing our JavaScript and our CSS into our markup like this. We have to separate these things out. So this great movement of the web, this separation of concerns, where we have the HTML separate from the CSS and separate from the JavaScript. And the idea was to create a stratification, to create layers to the web experience. Now, the layers, the drawing of those layers was around technology. HTML is a different kind of technology from CSS, which is a different technology from JavaScript. And we drew those lines that way. We still have separation of concerns, but it's almost like it's been flipped 90 degrees because now people that talk about separation of concerns, they don't so much talk about separation of technology concerns as much as they do business logic concerns. That leads us to the whole web of componentization over the last several years. These layers, what's important about them is that they became not required. They became optional. And it led us to the idea that we're going to be talking about this evening, this idea of progressive enhancement. The idea that there were strategies for how we could layer these things on. They used, for example, the metaphor of a cake, a birthday cake, where you can have the first layer of the cake, and if that's all you had, that would be great because, hey, who doesn't like cake? But then if you put on another layer of the cake and put on some icing and put on some decorations on the top, it just gets better and better and better, right? So if we start with HTML as our foundation, and then we layer on top the nice-looking CSS, and then we put on the interactivity of JavaScript on top, that's going to make this web of birthday cakes. So it was the optionality that was important. And remember that we drew those lines of optionality around technology. And then we started telling people that those lines were actually drawn because of what's good for the user. You see, we conflated that. We said, let's take a technological decision and say, no, it's actually about the user. It led to two major strategies. One of them, the original one, if you will, earlier before we even had progressive enhancement, we had what was called graceful degradation. The idea that we could have this nice experience, but if we were viewing it in a device that was less capable and for whatever reason could not do all of the things, couldn't show all the images or couldn't load all of the styles, then we could sort of degrade gracefully back into something that still worked, but maybe wasn't quite as sophisticated, wasn't quite as pretty, but it still got the job done. That was the idea of graceful degradation. Aaron Gustafson talked about graceful degradation, as did many others, but back in the day, he was one of the original ones that was really talking this up in a lot of his talks, and I went back and found this slide because this is a very common metaphor used to describe graceful degradation. It comes from a quote from the comedian Mitch Hedberg where he said, "I like an escalator because an escalator can never break. It can only become stairs." I wanted to give you the full context of that quote, by the way. This is the actual quote that he used in his comedy routine. An escalator can never break and only can become stairs. You should never see an escalator temporary out of order sign, just escalator temporary stairs. Sorry for the convenience. Okay, it's a funny bit, right? It works. But you can probably guess where I'm going with this. There's an awful lot of escalators that break and they don't become stairs. Right? It sounds good as a comedic bit, but it doesn't really work. This is not a picture I pulled off of Google Images. This is a picture I actually took my last trip to Vegas where, I don't know if you've ever been to Vegas, but having to go down the strip requires you to go up and down, up and down, up and down across all these pathways, and almost every one of their escalators is broken all the time. Every time I go there, their escalators are broken. So maybe that isn't such a great guiding principle for us. Maybe that idea that we can just easily fall back to something and it'll still get the job done, maybe it's more complicated than that. Now, we moved on from graceful degradation to the main topic for this evening, this progressive enhancement. And really, actually, progressive enhancement was just sort of the same thing as graceful degradation, just looked at from the other direction. With graceful degradation, we started with the perfect, beautiful thing that we could imagine in our heads, and then we fell back to something that was lesser but still capable. The idea behind progressive enhancement, which was launched, by the way, kind of officially to the world back at South by Southwest, back in the early days, in the early 2000s, it was launched, and I'll have a slide on that in just a moment, but when it was launched, the idea was, let's just flip that around and let's focus on the core thing. And as many people in the early 2000s were saying, content is king. Let's focus on content. And we'll make content the foundation, and we'll make content great. And then if things can be layered on top, like we can put all of that icing on top of our birthday cake, great. But if not, it doesn't matter because we still have a great content experience. That was the idea behind progressive enhancement. It was this opposite way of thinking where we could go from something that worked to something that was even better if their devices were capable of doing it. It's really just a mind shift set where we focus on the content instead of on the other stuff, and then we enhance if possible. So progressive enhancement has been one of the moral foundations of our industry for more than a decade, almost 15 years now. Actually, a little more than 15 years now. 2003 South by Southwest. And this was a slide from that original launch. And you'll notice that this particular slide I picked out, they're listing a whole bunch of various different browser hacks that you can use to try to get around all the weirdness of the browsers at the time and control precisely exactly how things displayed or detect whether something can't work or whatever. So we use all these crazy browser hacks to try to get around all these problems. And what was being said out of the mouths of these presenters was, this is so that we can make the web better for all of the web's users. But what was actually being done was, here's how we can make developers' lives more tractable, more easy. We're conflating the idea of what's good for the user comes from what is good for the developer. We told ourselves that we did all of this for the user. But did we? Did we do it for them, or did we do it for ourselves? So, I want you to ponder that, because it has been one of our guiding principles, and many of you here have already come up to me and said, I'm really worried that you're about to kill one of our sacred principles of this industry. You're about to talk badly about progressive enhancement. It's the most amazing thing we've ever invented. And remember back to the beginning, I'm not necessarily trying to say that it was bad or wrong, but I'm saying that I think it's reached its time. And I think we need to look into what we can do forward. I want to take a moment to talk about web performance, because this frames why I think progressive enhancement failed to live up to what we morally thought it was going to live up to. Web performance, if any of you remember back in the original days, this is the why slow list from way, way back in the day. These were all the things, the hit list that you were supposed to do to optimize the performance of your pages. And chief among those optimization strategies was to reduce the amount of time that it took between when the page started to load and when the user saw something as quickly as possible. We need to reduce that, and it began to expose a problem that maybe we hadn't thought about before. And that problem went by the acronym FOUC, which of course stands for not flash of uncolored character. It stands for flash of unstyled content. The idea that we are showing content as quickly as possible, but it looks ugly, and then all of a sudden it flashes and now it looks pretty. Now, when all that was just simply some colors, that's not a huge deal, but the more sophisticated the web got, the more disruptive this flash became. Where somebody might be looking at some text and then a split second later, everything completely rearranges and stuff is showing and hidden, and it's all in entirely different places. That's even more so true today when we're using technologies like CSS Grid, where things can be entirely out of document flow and they can appear very differently than they are in the document. And so this flash of unstyled content, if you were around at this time of the web, this became one of our big problems, because we were fighting the tension of saying, well, I want to get it to them faster because I've been told, and there's all the studies that tell me if they see it faster, they're going to love my website more. So I want to get it to them faster, but the problem is now they're seeing this thing that's really ugly. So how do we get around this flash of unstyled content? And we invented all kinds of ridiculous hacks to get around this flash. Arguably, I would say the spinner came as a result of the flash of unstyled content, because we said, we got to show them something, but we can't show them the ugly thing, so show them a little spinner instead. So FOUC actually exposed this problem that when we layer the web based upon technology, and we think that that is better for the user, it turns out the user actually hates it more. They hate seeing the unstyled content. Well, wait a minute, what does that do to our moral foundation then? If the user doesn't like the unstyled content, then why did we draw those lines that way? Why did we expose it? And why did we spend so many years trying to hide the thing that we created? In a more real context, and this is a shout out to our friend Jason, if you were in his talk this morning, he was talking about text and responsive text and all these very fancy things, way more than I even know about. But one of the things he made me promise to talk about was FOUC and FOUC. This is a more modern version of this exact same problem, because now web fonts are everywhere. And now what we have is people seeing text, and then it's switching into a different web font. And guess what? Users don't like that. They don't think that's awesome. We do. Developers are like, oh my God, look how it switched and everything reflowed and it was amazing. And look how stuff just hid and did the little ellipsis correctly and all that stuff. We love that. And users are like, why is this bouncing around so much? I was right in the middle of this sentence and now I have to start over because I've lost my place. So FOIT, flash of invisible text, is the text isn't shown up at all, or FOUC, the flash of unstyled text, it's in the wrong font and then it's shown. These are just two sides of the exact same problem as FOUC from more than 15 years ago. The problem is that we want to get stuff to you fast because we've been told that we should layer it that way. But then it turns out you don't like it, so we got to invent all these other crazy ways to hide that. And I think best of all is FOUC. And by the way, don't worry about Googling that term. You won't find it. This was me back in like 2012 talking about the flash of unbehaviored content. This is the worst of all because it's the giant tease to the user. You show them a fully styled, nice-looking thing like a button that has no JavaScript attached yet because the JavaScript is still loading in the background, and so they can't click it and do anything. Or worse, they click it and it's still a link that links off somewhere instead of doing the modal like they wanted or something. The flash of unbehaviored content. What I love about the flash of unbehaviored content is it really put the FU back into the web. Really just dug it right in there. This is what I mean by we got off track. We started with the right premise. Let's make the web better for the user. And then we immediately started making decisions based on what's best for us as developers. And that caused us to have to deal with these user experience problems and invent all kinds of crazy workarounds for them. Pat Meenan's here, webpagetest.org. If you haven't seen this, it's the de facto standard for you to figure out how your website is behaving on various different websites, and different browsers and different devices around the world. And they have this film strip view of your site, and you can see this blank white, and then you can see the thing loading. I chose to load up my bank. One of my credit card companies is Chase, and I chose to load up their bank site, and you can see for a full 2 seconds it's just completely white, and then they begin to show it. Let me zoom in on what that's actually looking like, though, because there's just spinners everywhere. That's how they're doing it, and the question is, do users really like spinners all over the place? I'm not making this up. They literally have that. They have 5 different spinners on their page. This is going to sound harsh, but this is basically the state of all art for all JavaScript frameworks, is that we made it easier to put more spinners on the page. Componentize everything, make it as small as possible, and everything gets its own spinner. Yay! It's great for developers, and it's not what users want. No user looks at that page and they're like, oh, thank God I saw the Chase logo quickly. Otherwise, what would I have done with my life for the next 20 seconds? Do they like these reflows and styles? Do they like these placeholders and spinners? And I would challenge you to say, I don't think that's what they want out of the web. At best, I think they're tolerating the stuff that we create. And that's hard to hear, because I've been part of this web community for my entire career, more than 2 decades. And if I really look myself in the mirror, if I really ask, does the user really love all that stuff that I've been created? I don't know that I can give an honest and emphatic yes. I felt good as a developer about all the cool stuff that I created, but I think they're just barely tolerating what it is that we've been creating. So where I want to go with this is I want to point out some lies or misconceptions or flaws in our reasoning that got us off track. And I want to address the first of them here, is this great lie that if we just layer things through the technology, that will be best for the user, that's morally correct for the user's perspective. I think that's the lie. I think by deciding those things based upon technology, we did a quick switcheroo. We said it's all about the user, but no, actually it's all about the technology. How many of you have ever been on a web page where there's some like video playing and it just starts pixelating for a while and then it goes back to regular and then maybe it pixelates again? Now, as developers, I would argue that our initial instinct is probably to be amazed at the technology that underlies that it doesn't stop, it doesn't have janky video, but somehow this developer was able to figure out how to monitor the bandwidth of that connection and automatically switch to a lower resolution and then switch back and do all of this fancy stuff. So we as developers are like, oh my God, that is so incredible how that player handles that so seamlessly. And what is the user going to think? Are they going to be amazed at how great that was? Or are they going to say, why is my ISP always so damn slow I can't watch my videos? Because they're not thinking in terms like we are as developers. They're not going to think about how that's a variable, frame rate stream or whatever. I don't even know the words. They're not going to be thinking about that. They're just going to be thinking about, I can't watch this video cleanly. What's wrong with this picture? The conceit of the movie Snow White. You all have seen the movie, the cartoon, the children's story Snow White. And the queen, the evil queen, she asks the mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all? The conceit, the ultimate irony of that story that we all know, but maybe it's hard to admit, is that when we look at a mirror and ask who's the fairest of them all, who are we going to see looking back at us? Ourselves. When you ask, what's the best for the web, and then you hold up a mirror, you're going to see your own preferences reflected right back at you. It's easy to say I'm doing something for the user. It's not as easy to walk that out. One of the greatest inventions since progressive enhancement, arguably, is responsive design. And I love Ethan Marcotte. He's fantastic. What a great human being he is. He goes by Beep. If you don't follow him, you absolutely should. He does fantastic work. And he was kind of the originator. He was the originator. He coined this idea of responsive design. This idea that we could design stuff to look nice on a phone and nice on a tablet and nice on a desktop and portrait versus landscape and all that stuff. We could do this stuff so that the user just had a nice experience no matter which device they decided to use to enjoy our web experience. And this sounds like it's all about the user. And again, the moral guiding light, yes, we want this user experience to be great. But the truth of the matter is that responsive design, at least the way it has become, is that responsive design is all about, I just want to write my code once. I don't want to write 5 different websites. I don't want to write 15 different websites. Can I just write one website and somehow make it all like rearrange itself? And we justify it like this. All of you are going to know exactly what I'm talking about. We move the window around and we're like, how awesome is it that when I move this browser window around, everything just like flows around? How cool is that? And the truth is, not one time in the history of the web has a real user ever done that. Never, ever. Never, ever. We do, because it's fun. I do it all the time. It's fun. But it's not how real users interact. As a matter of fact, when you have this responsive design that shows a bunch of cool stuff on a desktop, and then that user switches to their phone because now they got to go pick their kids up from school and they're reading something, and now they're looking at it in a phone layout design, same page, you wrote the code once, now it's the same page, it is more likely that the user is going to be annoyed that the stuff that they could see before is now hidden behind a hamburger menu. It's more likely that they're going to notice the difference between these two now. And they're going to be more frustrated than they were before. Responsive design is great, and I don't mean to talk down about it at all, but it does ask the question, is this a little bit sketchy is it murky that this is all about the user? But I'm going to say that the worst danger of this lie is not even about the responsive design. It's really about the divide that it creates in the community. And Chris, who gave the fantastic opening keynote this morning, he made a couple of comments about this, but I want to bring back this article to your attention. The Great Divide, the divide in the web community, and it's a fantastic article. You definitely should read it if you have not read it. He did a great job, so I'm not criticizing him in any way, but he might have missed a little bit of context for this friction, maybe just a little bit. So I want to color it with a little bit more backstory, because this is stuff that I personally have felt. in the web. As someone who has grown up more aligned in the JavaScript side of the divide than in the HTML, CSS side of the divide, I have been on the receiving end of a number of what I will call very insulting or condescending remarks about those who prefer JavaScript as their primary means, their primary media. And I just pulled out a couple of examples. Here's one example. This one says, I'm a big fan of using JavaScript, but really only if it's absolutely necessary, just as the last resort, only if HTML and CSS can't do it. This is my primary technology, and I've built my entire career on trying to specialize in JavaScript, and I hear from these amazing beacons of knowledge and wisdom on the other side, it's really kind of just the worst possible fallback. That doesn't speak to me like those people respect what I do and what I care about. And by the way, there's plenty of blame, so hold on. If you're worried that all I'm going to do is bash on that side, there's plenty of blame. But I just want to point out that it's sometimes hard to remember just how much negativity goes in both directions. Because it's not just tweets like this, it's also tweets like this one. And I love Eric. I've met Eric before, and I think he's a great person. But he says stuff like, co-signed with added expletives, if you can't develop for the actual web, find a platform that suits you. The context of this was, if you can't figure out a way to build for the web with just HTML and CSS, then you're not building the actual web. And that condescension stings. And it creates this divide. When we talk down about somebody else because of their chosen profession or their chosen focus within this profession, it creates this divide. And it goes even deeper than that. This one was basically about a proposal that Chrome was making, or I forget which web browser, but I think it was WebKit. They were going to cut off JavaScript file downloads at some arbitrary file size, just whatever the bytes limit was, they were just going to cut it off. That's how far devolved this problem, and I'm not denying that there's a problem in the web with the way JavaScript is abused with ads and the terrible performance and all that stuff. I'm not denying any of that problem, but it's devolved so poorly that the best conversation that we can have is, let's just arbitrarily cut off the file download. We can't come up with any other discussion about how we can encourage the optimization of these things other than just cut off the file download. And this is what I mean when I say, there's been a lot of attacks coming because JavaScript is seen as what's wrong with the web. I could have thrown up 1,000 different tweets that I found in a search about JavaScript is what's wrong with the web. And for someone who so deeply cares about JavaScript, that hurts to think that this technology is what's wrong with the web. But as I said, there's plenty of blame to go on both sides because many people that are in the JavaScript community have been hurling as many insults back, if not more, towards the other direction. Many of my peers, and I'm ashamed to say that sometimes I've done these things unintentionally, I think, but I've done these things. I've created this divide, or I've contributed to this divide. Tom Dale, this post was back in 2013, so in all fairness, I don't know whether he still holds these views, but there are many who do, so I'm talking about the views and not about the person. He proclaimed, by the way, that progressive enhancement is dead, so I'm not the first person to stand up and say that, but his argument was really flawed in my opinion. Because his argument was, there's no such thing as any useful website on the web today in 2013 that doesn't include JavaScript. And therefore, because progressive enhancement was all about making JavaScript optional, then progressive enhancement is now pointless. What kind of a terrible straw man ridiculousness is that? And I can imagine for someone that's in that community to hear that kind of an argument, they're just withdrawing and creating more of this divide. This argument perpetuates that divide rather than fixing that divide. It's become almost religious at this point. And we can't seem to figure out how to appreciate and respect the other people. And it's because we drew those lines on the technology. Instead of drawing those lines about what's best for the user, we created the divide at the very beginning. And we shouldn't be surprised that that divide continues to perpetuate today. By the way, just on this question of no JavaScript for a moment, is that even relevant, a still relevant use case? Is there any reason why anybody should still build a website that can work when their JavaScript is completely turned off in a browser? This is a pertinent and important question, and there's a lot of strong feelings on either side of it. There's tons of statistics, like I think somewhere in the UK government said that 1.3% of all web visitors were coming to their page without JavaScript enabled, so that's still hundreds of thousands or millions of people. So is it still a big thing? But all of those statistics, you can just throw them out the window because they don't matter to this question. The only thing that really matters to answer this question is on a case-by-case basis for the web experience that you are creating, is there a reasonable and useful experience that does not require JavaScript? Is that possible? Some of you may immediately begin to think, when you hear this, people rear back and they say, no, because I build like 3D, first-person shooter games, and I can't imagine an HTML and CSS version of a 3D first-person shooter game, so no, this is not relevant. I want to test that for just a moment. Let's take an example like a mapping application like Google Maps. I'm sure all of you have probably used Google Maps either on the desktop browser, on your phone, all these other kinds of devices. It's really kind of amazing how sophisticated that this is, how much of an application this is. And while it's not a first-person shooter, I think most of us would call this more a web application than we would call it a web page. Okay? So it fits clearly and squarely in that realm of this is a web application. We can't imagine what web mapping on the web would be like without all of this sophisticated JavaScript. Except really? Have none of you been around to remember MapQuest? Because MapQuest predated Google by many, many years, and MapQuest didn't use any of that fancy JavaScript scrolling and zooming in. You see those blue things around the outside of the map? You would click the blue thing, and it would flash away the map and then reload the new map tiles in the new position. And it was amazing when it was created. To go from whatever we did with paper maps in our glove box compartments to that was like light years jump. And we thought, this is the pinnacle of web experience around mapping. And then Google Maps came around. And the point that I'm trying to make is that even something that you think is so sophisticated that couldn't possibly have a no JavaScript version, maybe there's a completely reasonable version of it. I bet there are still millions of people in the world that load up MapQuest every day and use it every day. The entire debate has been ignoring the most important part: who's experiencing the web. Alex Russell, many of you know him from Google. Alex Russell sent out this tweet, and he said, I strongly suspect that if you got up on stage and asserted, we're here to make users' lives better and should therefore demonstrate our technology choices first do no harm, you'd start a brawl at a modern front-end conference. Alex, I'm at a modern front-end conference, and I'm standing on a stage and saying that we should consider the users and not doing harm to them first. It should be the most important thing. And I really hope that nobody comes up and punches me in the face after this. But he's absolutely right. That we should be demonstrating that we're not doing harm to the user and to their experience. So can we really actually fight for the user? I mean, not just say it and be like, yeah, we feel good about it, but can we legitimately put their concerns first? There is a principle, the priority of constituencies, in the HTML specification. How many of you have ever read any part of the HTML specification? Okay, I'm just going to go out here and say that's a lot less than 1/3 of you. We're in a room at a modern web development conference, and we are talking about building the web, and less than 1/3 of you have read the foundational document for our industry. At the very top of that document, section 3.2, I believe, it says, in case of conflict, consider users over authors, over implementers, and so on and so forth. In other words, when there's a conflict between the priorities, guess who wins? It's supposed to be the user. How often have we lost sight of that foundational principle that's supposed to be guiding us? Now, I want to talk about how we fix some of these problems, and I'm going to increment through a couple of different ideas. First off, I want to talk about a phrase that I've tried to use a number of times. I've even given talks about this where I've said the next step from responsive design, maybe we should call it adaptive design. I thought it was really cool for coining this term, adaptive design, because it's both responsive to the screen size, but also adaptive to the device environment. In other words, it's monitoring the whole experience, not just what happens in the first 100 milliseconds. So I've been talking about this, and I've been trying to convince people we need to go beyond this. We need to ask this stuff. But the problem is that I got it wrong too. Because adaptation, if you think about it from a biological perspective, the problem with adaptation is that it's based on accidental survival. Okay? It's based on mistakes accidentally working out for good. In other words, we're building this site where we're just trying to guess what limitations the user has and maybe accidentally work around them. We're only accidentally right maybe some of the time. So my question to you to ponder is, what if we didn't have to guess what the user wanted and needed? Could we make the web better for them if we didn't have to guess? The browser is often referred to as the user agent, UA abbreviated. And many of you, I'm sure, have heard that term. You know what I don't love about the term agent, though, is that an agent implies somebody that represents you. They're like a go-between for you. You don't get to interact directly. This agent is in between and negotiating and preparing everything. They're separating you from the actual direct subject matter. What I wish that UA meant is user advocate. If I had somebody that was advocating on my behalf for me to have the best and most optimal experience, that's what I would rather have, not somebody that's acting as a gateway that stops my experience from being best. And I know that browsers think of themselves as advocates for the users, but even in the words that we use to describe our industry, we get off track. So I want you to think about advocating. How can a website and a piece of technology like a browser and a device, how can it advocate for the user? Now, the dirty word in the room is configuration, because when I said, how many of you think that it would be great if we could just ask the user, or maybe we didn't have to guess, many of you, your brains went immediately to the full end of the spectrum. You're so used to this whole convention over configuration thing that configuration is the dirt. We immediately think there's no way the web could possibly work if users had to configure their experience. And I'm going to completely agree with you that there is no real user in the world that will ever go and open up Chrome flags and start flipping checkboxes. It'll never happen, okay? There's no user that does that on a normal basis. In fact, I would imagine most of the people that have JavaScript disabled, they didn't do that. Some plugin did that for them. Some administrator did that for them. They did not do that themselves, because general real users are not going to get into that kind of level of detail. They don't know what it is. Their eyes glaze over and they just move on, okay? That's created for us, which is fine. We can play around with that stuff while we're developing, but that's not the future of the web, is to just tell users, go start fiddling around with Chrome flags. That's not what I'm saying. But imagine if we designed cars the way we design the web right now, because we basically decide as developers the entire experience, and then the device even further decides the experience that the user wants, and we don't even ask the user. We're not even concerned with whether the user wants the experience. It would be like if you got in your car and your car had pre-tuned a radio station that it picked based upon your browsing habits or something. It picked the radio station, and there was no dial to change the radio or even turn it off. It's just like, listen, we've decided this is what you want to listen to, so go ahead and listen to this music while you drive. And maybe the headlights don't even come on, but that's okay, because we've determined that it's daytime. You don't need headlights even though it's raining outside. You know, if we just, oh, and by the way, you just pull over to the side of the road, open up the trunk, and unplug stuff if you need to configure your car experience. That's basically the mindset that we have. It's an all or nothing, right? We can't imagine asking the user, because we immediately go to the extreme of, oh, they never mess around with Chrome flags or something. There is somewhere in between where a user can have some say-so, and that's what I'm getting at here. So what I want to say is that when you take the nexus of these three things, the product, the UI, and really legitimately the user experience, not just wireframes, but like actual live user experience in all the various different conditions that user experience incorporates, not just the happy path. When you take that entire nexus together, what you get is not responsive design. What you get is imprintable design, as in the user is imprinted on the experience. So yes, I'm trying to coin a new phrase now, and here's your hashtag, imprintable design, okay? Come on, that's supposed to get a little bit of laughs or something. Imprintable design, that's your new fancy hashtag, okay? Tell Beep I said responsive design is done. I'm kidding, okay? But we should be asking ourselves, how could we design the web where the user was imprinted onto the experience? Because they're the most important part. Not what you wanted to build, not what your product manager instructed you to build, not what your marketing department sold to people. None of that is as important as how does the person experience it. So progressive enhancement was about the developers and the technology. And what I'm getting at here is that what we need to do is be focused on each person that's experiencing it. And I want to deliberately shift that attention away from the word user to the word person. Okay, we often just use user, but I want to deliberately shift that attention away. Designing for consistency. This is a big one. As a matter of fact, most of the hacks that we've created in our industry have been about how can we design so that you get the exact same experience. It's pixel perfect everywhere you go. The button's always exactly lined 3 pixels below the logo and all. Like, how can we get it exactly the same? And we've invented an uncountable number of hacks to try to make that happen. And what I would say to you, I was having this discussion just earlier, can you imagine that what we're doing is trying to build for 7.6 billion people? There is no possible way that you could design a consistent experience that works well for 7.6 billion people. That's the worst possible thing you can do. No technical user has ever bounced from your site because you use native form controls or the scroll bar, and then they were like, ooh, it looks different in Firefox versus Chrome or iOS versus Android. That does not happen. That's not what they're concerned with. They're not going to not buy from your website just because, the button is 3 pixels further down and to the right. That isn't what's concerning them. So the flaw that we're designing for consistency, by the way, let me invoke somebody that many of you know, Zelman. Huge respect, one of basically the grandfathers and founding fathers of what we do. He said it this way: not identical, not pixel perfect. As web designers and developers, our aim is to ensure that no matter how a user chooses to explore our sites, the content is perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And he was quoting another speaker, which is great. But this is one of our guiding lights, one of the sources of all wisdom in our industry. And he said it exactly right. It is the worst possible thing we could try to do to optimize for consistency, the most ineffective priority that we could possibly choose. Another flaw is that if the device can do it, the user wants it. I want to give you an example because I don't live here in Canada. I travel a lot. So I'm based in the US and I have T-Mobile, which is great. I get great Wi-Fi and data on my phone and stuff like that, but I travel a lot, and the reason I have T-Mobile is because for US-based customers, you get free roaming data wherever you go, like in 200 and something countries. It's awesome. I don't have to pay for all of this data. The catch is it's at 2G speeds. So I spend more than a third, almost a half of my year on the road, most of that time in places like Europe, South America, and I get to experience this awesome web that all the rest of us have built at 2G speeds. And I can tell you that it is not the same as what you're seeing in your office wired into a hardwired internet connection. Much has been said about this, but I think we sort of think of it as like the punchline to a joke, and I'm telling you that I personally experience it day in and day out, that I can't even load your website. Now you think to yourself, well, that's okay because I'm not selling to people in South America, or I'm not selling to people in rural Europe, so I don't care, they're not my customer. Am I your customer when I'm here in the US or when I'm in Canada? Am I your customer? Yes. I open up an app. Let's say it's a bus route app. And maybe this bus route app detects that my device is capable of doing WebGL rendering, and so it decides that what I want is a 3D rendered view of my bus route for some reason. And so it starts showing me this 3D route where I can fly through the buildings. It's really, really cool, y'all. It's awesome. So I'm your customer, I've paid for your app, I'm using your app. And then I get on a plane and I fly to some other part of the world, and am I still your customer? I mean, that logic would say I cease to be your customer once I stop being under the perfect happy path. But I think I'm still your customer because I still paid money. So I open up your app, and by the way, when I was using it at home, I had perfect connectivity and I had a full battery power, but now it's 11:30 at night, it's raining, I'm in London, and the last bus is about to come, and my battery level is at 2%. Do you think that what I'm interested in is opening up your app and getting the WebGL rendered version of that page? That's not what I want. But there is precisely zero way for me to communicate my reality to that web experience. The designers decided that that's what I wanted because my device was capable of doing it. So why don't we ask the user whether that's really what they want? And by the way, when you're thinking about this power thing, we're so tempted to think, oh, it's no big deal. We've got all the power in the world. You can just keep all the, the power is unlimited. Guess what? It's not. Power is not unlimited. It's not always reliable, and it's definitely not always free. I have been to a rural village in Africa. This is not an actual picture of it. It's close I could find. Been to a rural village in Africa many years ago, where in this town, if you can call it a town, it's really a village, a bunch of huts, where people live 9, 10, 15 people in a hut the size of this stage. I'm not exaggerating. And in the center of town, there's one light pole with one electrical line coming from who knows where, some other village, and hundreds of cell phones plugged in and just hanging, dangling off of the light pole. And I asked people about it, and they said it takes almost a day to get a full charge of their phone hanging off of that, and they have to pay a day's salary to do so. So we just happily ship all of this stuff, and we don't even care because battery is unlimited and recharging is unlimited. And we don't even stop to ask ourselves, in fact, what is the environmental impact of all this usage of energy? We just think that energy is free, and it's not. I encourage you to read that article. It's eye-opening about how we are impacting the world, the physical world, by the choices we're making on the web. So who is it that's using the site? If it's not the user, I'm going to argue that it's got to be about more humanity. It's got to be about a person. We usually use analytics to decide this. We use statistics. And Mark Twain said that there are 3 kinds of lies: lies, damn lies, and statistics. Because statistics marginalize people. We choose the average person on our website and we say, listen, less than 1% of people seem to need this accessibility feature or seem to need this thing, so we don't even worry about it. It's not part of our product. And those 1% of people, it's 100% a bad experience for them. It's 100% a bad experience for them. The common thread across all of my comments up to this point is that we know better than any of those users do what experience they should have. Us, the designer, us, the builder, and even the device maker. We all know better than they do. But do we? Can we possibly do that? I learned this term just a little while ago, a numeronym. I don't even know if I pronounced that correctly, where you do like a letter and then numbers and then some other one. Here's a new numeronym for you, E12Y, empowerability. How much is your web experience empowering the person who's experiencing it? Accessibility, right? I don't mean to diminish accessibility, but I'm really concerned with how are you empowering the people that experience it? Because that's a much higher bar than just, can they barely get, accessibility, if we really get down to it, if you have the 5% of websites that give any damn whatsoever about accessibility, they do the bare minimum to pass some legal bar. The bare minimum that somebody can possibly even remotely use our experience. That's not the bar that we should be trying to attain. We should be going after this higher bar where we're empowering people. There's your hashtags again, okay? So ultimately, the user is the wrong focus. Because a user is all about the utility, like what can they do and what can they do for us and how can they interact and can they click and can they scroll and all that stuff, and that's so gross. Customer is also not the right way to think about them because it's even worse. Like, what is their monetary value to me as a company? We need to be thinking about the people. They're human beings. Person means that we recognize and celebrate their autonomy, their agency, their individuality, and their merit. Those are the things that we should be striving for. If we want a moral imperative, it's that we build a web that celebrates people and empowers people. Another flaw is that the browser knows best. I've kind of hinted at this already, but the flaw that the browser knows best, and I know many people that work at browsers, some of them are here today, and I don't mean to criticize browsers. I understand the challenges that they go through because they're dealing with so many different constituencies, but I don't think that it's really true that the browser can know best, because the browser has access to some information that a user doesn't know, but actually most of the important information the browser doesn't know either, okay? For example, we can ask, does the browser know how much CPU and memory is available? Yes, the browser can know that, and it can contribute that to the discussion about deciding what experience is best for the user. Check, we can give them that. But what about all the other things, like, for example, does the browser know if their environment gives them free, fast, reliable power? Nope. Does it know if they have unlimited data and that data is okay because it's free and it isn't metered and costing them money? Nope. The browser doesn't know anything about that. Does the browser know if their hands are usable? Maybe a fully abled person broke their arm, and now they only have one arm, and in that arm is their toddler. So wait, same device and same customer, but their experience is now entirely different. And guess what? The browser is never going to know that stuff. The only one who knows what their reality is the person experiencing that reality. And here's an often forgotten one: lighting conditions, right? I can't tell you how many times I've been reading a blog post and everything's great, and then I walk out into the sun and all of a sudden I can't even finish reading the blog post because they didn't use high contrast enough colors or whatever, because the device can't possibly know all of these different things that are happening like I can. So why don't we ask the user to have some input? Why can't we just ask them? You're thinking there's no way we can ask them to do all of these things because they'll never be able to think about all these technical terms. And I agree with you, they're not going to think about it in technical terms. But it doesn't mean that they can't think in terms of their experience. We already have precedent for this, by the way. Some of you have seen this idea where on a website you can select what font size. And we normally think of that as an accessibility thing. I actually found hundreds of examples when I was Googling around about sites where you can toggle. This is a news site, I think New York Times, where you can toggle the font size. And we think about that as like a fun little toy, but for some people that's a critical part of their experience. We ask the user, how big would you like the text to be? Instead of deciding, oh, we have some cool font unit called Rem that already decided for you. Why not just ask the user what font size they want? Let them decide. And you might think this is some fringe idea. This is a recommendation by W3. By W3C, it's a recommendation to allow people to do this. And it's the precedent that, in my closing minutes with you, it's the precedent that I want you to think about going forward. Because this shouldn't be the exception to the rule. This and all the other parts of the experience should be what we're asking. Any of you have ever used Gmail before? I'm sure you've loaded up Gmail. And I don't know if you've ever noticed, but that little link down there that says load basic HTML, this is a godsend when I'm on 2G internet speeds, because I go down and click that thing, and bam, there's my webmail, but it's in an HTML, it's not using all this fancy JavaScript, it's not using as much battery power, and it loads 10 times as fast. Now think about the developers on the Gmail team that are still maintaining this site. Why do they still prioritize maintaining this site even in 2019? Because they recognize some people are going to be experiencing our webmail client in a less than optimal condition, and we should give them some sort of choice. At a bare minimum, shouldn't we ask somebody, hey, would you like the stripped down version of this experience? For whatever reason, is that what you would prefer? Why don't we even ask them just that? I sure wish Google Maps would ask me that. Maybe it could buy MapQuest and switch back to MapQuest or something. Okay? So the flaw that we're talking about here is that people will always want the most powerful experience. That they want everything to be maxed out, and that's not what they want. Turns out Facebook and Opera Mini learned, I got this great story from Bruce Lawson. Facebook used to serve up this specific version of their app to the 1-point-something billion Opera Mini users in the world. They would serve up this very stripped-down version of the Facebook app. So they literally had like a custom version of it just for that browser being shipped out to people that they'd worked with Facebook to make sure was working great. And one day, somebody realized that they had a more powerful version, so they flipped a switch and turned on the more powerful version of Facebook, and they got millions of complaints from users. Now, wait a minute. Why'd they get complaints from users? Well, it turns out users preferred the simple, fast, quick experience. And they were mad that somebody went and upgraded their experience thinking that that's what they would expect. It turns out that's not what always drives the user. It's not that they always are driven by, I want a maximal experience. So we need a new term to go forward. Progressive enhancement, it sounds great. It had a lot of really great ideals behind it. It had a lot of really great ideals behind it, but we need to move forward. It could be progressive experience. That could work. It could be personalized experience. You notice I'm keeping the PE because people love their acronyms. Here's a better one. people empathy. That's what should drive us. People empathy and in printable design. That's the principles that should be driving us as we go forward. So I have this question, how do we begin practicing it? I'll have a few more moments with you, so this is going to feel way too abbreviated. I'm not trying to solve this problem, but get you to ask this question more deeply of the things that you're building on the web. How do we begin doing that? They have to be given more control. The people experiencing it have to be given more control. There's precedent for it. There's plenty of precedent. We have things like prefers color scheme and prefers reduced motion. These are things that adjust the experience, even readability mode, or reader mode. They adjust the experience after everything's been delivered. But there's also things that send information to the server, that tell the server about it, these client hints, headers, and things. Except most web pages, most web servers and applications aren't paying any attention to any of that stuff. They're not receiving that data from the browser. What we need to do is build upon that to embrace and to extend that idea. That information can be sent to the server, and the server can serve up an experience that is best for what that user at that moment wants. It's not based upon feature testing. So how do we simplify that to non-technical terms? That's the major question that I need to answer. How do we do that? I think users understand three basic currencies. I think they understand three basic currencies that really aren't about technology. One of them is they understand speed. I understand that when I open up this page or this app, everything starts going slower on my phone. They don't need to understand megahertz. They just know slower than it was before, so I'm closing it out. They get speed. It is a currency that they understand. Another one that they understand is battery level. They don't need to understand anything at the physics level or anything about that. They just get, man, my battery has to be recharged a lot more often when I use that stupid website, so I don't use it anymore. They understand at a very instinctual level, non-technical at all, my battery's draining. That sucks. And I think they also understand the cost, the real cost of the bandwidth that they're paying for. These are real currencies that users are willing to either spend or wanting to save when they're experiencing your website. So we wrap all of those up into one kind of calculation, if you will, that a user can specify in a very non-technical way. How much of those currencies am I willing to spend for my experience versus how much of that do I want to save for my experience? And I call this the fidelity slider. This is just one possible idea. I envision that on the browsers, like notice up there on the address bar, there's just slides down and then there's just a little slider and a user can just slide it back and forth to determine what fidelity of experience that they're willing to tolerate and want at this moment. When they slide it all the way to the right, like it's the default, they want everything. Give me all the WebGL, all the stuff, all the fonts, all the images. But if they slide it to the left, maybe they're expressing in a very non-technical sense, I'm willing to accept a lower fidelity experience because my reality is different right now. Could we ask a user to just pick what kind of fidelity they want? That's really all I'm asking here. And maybe this is literally just a number from 0 to 1 sent to the server, and then the server makes a decision, what am I going to send based upon that? We're going to decide not to build things in layers of technology, but in degrees of fidelity. It's not about HTML, CSS, or JavaScript. It's about how much fidelity does the user want and need at this point. So maybe it's just as simple as you configure your web app like you do responsive. You configure your web app to send different images and different resources and turn off components and other things based upon those different fidelity levels. Maybe it's as simple as that. Maybe these ideas are terrible and there's something else that's even better than this idea, but the conversation needs to start. How can a user express what kind of fidelity that is best for them at this moment? We can send or skip all of these fancy things. We can send or skip whole features and components in our app based upon the expressed preference of fidelity. We can alter the behavior of the experience by batching up requests, by switching on and off our spa mode and going back to the old school mode, and even treating it like it's an offline app for a while. We can do all of these things based upon the user saying, I need less fidelity or I'm willing to spend more to get more fidelity right now. But most controversial of all, the browser is going to have to veto this because your sites and your servers are still going to send all that crap. And the user has to have some way that their advocate steps in and says, no, we're not going to do any of that stuff. We're not going to display WebGL right now because the user has said they don't want that fidelity at this moment. As I close, I want you to consider these first steps. The first question that you should be asking is, well, he just he proposed something that requires the browsers to move. So should we wait until the browsers do it? And let me emphatically say no. We cannot and should not wait for the browsers to just go do this. I've been having this exact conversation with a number of people that I'm friends with, colleagues that work on browsers at the different ones, Chrome and Firefox and others, and I've been telling them this, and you know what their response is? We don't see developers asking users right now, so we would never prioritize a feature like that. Well, that's a catch-22, right? Because we don't ask them, they're not going to build it so that we can ask them. We got to break that catch-22 and start doing it right now, like with those font size selectors and the load basic Gmail link and 100 other possible ways that we can expose to a user. Maybe just build your own fidelity slider at the top, or a checkbox that says high res or not high res, or something like that. Ask the user to decide and express their preference at that moment. And the idea is that we move to options and choices. We embrace those things. I mean, when you think about it, if you're on like a video call, you can turn off your camera even if you're on a video call, right? Why do they do that? Because the user knows right now, I don't want to be seen on camera, or right now my bandwidth sucks and I don't want to have crappy experience on this call. The user can decide all those things. We already have precedent for this, but we don't consider that to be important. That's sort of like a tertiary feature, and I'm trying to accelerate that to the very most important thing we do on the web, is begin to expose those options and choices to the user. That starts with you. And I promise, if we did that at large in the web, if we started asking them to imprint themselves on our experience, the browsers would catch up. And maybe they'd do the fidelity slider, or maybe they'd do something entirely different and better than my idea. But the point is that we would have a web where users and people were imprinted and empowered. And there's lots of objections, like my boss will never approve this, and they'll never think that there's any customer value to it, and all of that stuff. And let me just plainly say, you did not ask your boss for permission to swap out Webpack for some other builder or bundler. You didn't ask permission to redesign and React. You didn't ask permission for any of those things because you just knew that they were best for the developer. How much more, and in terms of morality, how much more should we just do what's right for the user, whether the product manager wants it or not? Whether anybody at your company understands it, you're here, and if you believe me that it is the person who matters most, then you should insist on exposing these things and let everybody else catch up. Don't ask for permission to make the web better. I'm giving you permission. Please, go make the web better for all 7.6 billion people on the planet. I close with this. This is an article that was cited many, many times in defense of progressive enhancement and saying why we should continue to do progressive enhancement, even in the onslaught of people saying maybe it's not a great idea. And it closed with this point. It said, no one has disproved the benefits of progressive enhancement or proposed a better technique. It's kind of a strange argument. But I just want to ask, have I? Thank you very much for listening. Have a great evening.